The sound of my father's hand hitting my face echoed down the hospital corridor, and in that moment, time seemed to fracture into sharp, jagged pieces that cut through every memory I'd been trying to protect. I stood there frozen, my cheek burning where his palm had connected, feeling the weight of every eye in that hallway pressing against me like physical force. Nurses pausing mid-stride with clipboards clutched to their chests, other families visiting their own sick loved ones suddenly silent and staring, a security guard at the far end already moving toward us with purpose in his stride. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but she didn't move to comfort me, didn't step between us, didn't do anything except stand there looking horrified that this private family dysfunction had just become devastatingly public. My brother Marcus stood at my father's other side, and for just a second, I saw something flicker across his face. Shock, maybe, or discomfort. But it vanished so quickly, I might have imagined it, replaced by that familiar expression of detached observation he'd perfected over the years. The look that said whatever was happening to me wasn't quite real enough to require his intervention. "Pay rent, or get out of my house, you ungrateful parasite," my father shouted, his face still red from the heart attack that had brought us all here just 2 hours ago, the hospital gown hanging loosely on his frame making him look simultaneously vulnerable and venomous. The thing was, I hadn't lived in his house for 6 years, not since I was 22 and fresh out of graduate school, when I'd packed my belongings into my beat-up Honda and driven away from that suffocating childhood home to build something they couldn't see, wouldn't see, refused to acknowledge as real. But standing there with my face throbbing and tears threatening to spill from my eyes, I realized that in their minds, I had never really left at all, that I would always be their failure, their disappointment, the daughter who couldn't measure up to Marcus the investment banker with his corner office and his expensive suits, and his ability to make our father smile with genuine pride. They didn't know that while they'd been dismissing my work as playing scientist and tinkering with toys, I had built a medical device company worth $12 million. They didn't know that for the past 3 years, I had been paying their mortgage, all $20,400 every single month, after secretly purchasing their debt when my father's restaurant collapsed and bankruptcy loomed. They didn't know that the cardiac monitoring devices keeping my father alive in this very hospital were designed by my team, approved by the FDA through my company, saving lives in over 200 hospitals across the country. They didn't know any of this because I had never told them, because every time I tried to share anything about my real life, I was met with dismissal or mockery, or that particular brand of parental disappointment that feels like drowning in shallow water. But that day at the hospital, something in me finally broke. I wasn't always invisible to them. Or maybe I was, and I just didn't realize it until Marcus came along and showed me what being seen actually looked like in our family. I was 5 years old when my brother was born, and I remember standing on my tiptoes to peer into his bassinet, feeling something I didn't have words for yet. A premonition maybe, or just the instinctive understanding that everything was about to change. And it did change, gradually at first, and then completely, like watching the sun set, and suddenly realizing you're standing in darkness. Marcus was the kind of child who seemed to collect achievements the way other kids collected Pokemon cards. Every sport he tried, he excelled at. Every test he took, he aced. Every room he entered, he commanded. And our parents orbited around him like he was the sun, and they were just grateful to exist in his light. I remember being 12 years old, standing in the kitchen with a report card full of straight A's clutched in my hand, waiting for my father to finish reading the newspaper so I could show him. And when he finally looked up and glanced at the paper, he said, "That's nice, Sarah," in the same tone he might use to acknowledge that I'd told him it was raining outside. That same week, Marcus brought home a trophy for winning some middle school basketball tournament, and my father mounted it on the mantel like it was the Olympic torch, called all his friends to brag, took Marcus out for steaks at the expensive restaurant downtown. When I got my acceptance letter to MIT 4 years later, full scholarship, early admission, one of only 30 students selected from thousands of applicants. My mother hugged me and said, "That's wonderful, sweetie. But when are you going to find a nice boyfriend? Your father worries you spend too much time with books." I went to my college graduation alone because my parents had left halfway through the ceremony to drive 3 hours to Marcus's company event, some promotion party at his investment banking firm that apparently couldn't happen without them there to witness it. I sat in the auditorium afterward in my cap and gown, watching other families take photos and go out to celebratory dinners, and I told myself it didn't matter, that I was doing this for me, not for them. 3 years ago, I made the mistake of thinking things might be different, that maybe now that I had my PhD and was starting my own company, they might finally take me seriously. I planned a family dinner, practiced what I would say, how I would explain my business plan and the contracts I was negotiating and the patents pending. But before I could say anything, my father launched into a story about his restaurant troubles, and when I tried to interject with, "Dad, I have something exciting to share," he actually held up his hand to silence me and said, "Stop playing scientist and get a real job, Sarah. Real problems are happening here." My mother's response to everything was always the same. "Don't upset your father, Sarah. You know how he is." As if his cruelty was weather, something to be endured rather than challenged. Marcus learned early that he could say anything to me and disguise it as brotherly teasing. "Still tinkering with toys in that lab, sis?" he'd say at family gatherings, and everyone would laugh like it was affectionate ribbing instead of what it actually was, which was dismissal dressed up as humor. The truth was that I had 3 patents approved, a company with real employees and real revenue, publications in medical journals that people in my field actually read and cited. But none of that mattered, because in my family's eyes, I would always be the disappointment, the one who couldn't quite measure up, the daughter who stubbornly insisted on pursuing something they couldn't understand, instead of just getting married and giving them grandchildren like a normal person. I kept hoping that one day, something would change. I was wrong. 3 years before that hospital hallway confrontation, I stood in my small office at MedTech Innovations with a contract in my hands that represented everything I'd been working toward. $2.3 million from a major hospital network that wanted to pilot my cardiac monitoring system in 15 facilities across the Northeast. I remember staring at the signature page, running my fingers over the embossed letterhead, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, which was the unmistakable certainty that I had done something real, something significant, something that would finally make my family understand that I wasn't just playing around in a lab. I called my mother that afternoon and told her I wanted to host a family dinner, something special. And I could hear the surprise in her voice, because I never asked for family gatherings. I just showed up when summoned and tried to take up as little space as possible. I spent 2 days preparing, bought an expensive bottle of wine my father liked, practiced in the mirror how I would tell them about the contract, about the 3 hospitals that had already seen 40% reduction in cardiac event response times using my devices, about the patent applications that were moving through approval. But when we all sat down at my parents' dining room table that Saturday evening, before I could even mention that I had news to share, my father cleared his throat in that way he did when he was about to make an announcement, and he said his restaurant was failing, that he was losing money every month, that the debt had climbed to $80,000, and bankruptcy was looming like a storm cloud he couldn't escape. My mother started crying immediately, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin, and Marcus leaned forward with this expression of concerned competence that I recognized from every family crisis we'd ever had. The look that said he was about to fix everything, because that's what golden children do. I sat there with my news trapped in my throat, the contract I'd brought to show them still folded in my purse, and I tried to interject with, "Dad, I actually have something that might help," but he cut me off with a sharp wave of his hand and said, "Not now, Sarah. Real problems are happening here." And those 4 words landed like stones in my chest. Marcus offered to loan them $10,000 right there at the table, and my father's face transformed, his eyes actually welling up with tears, as he reached across and gripped Marcus's hand and said, This is what a son does. This is what family means. And my mother nodded and smiled at Marcus, like he'd just offered them a kidney instead of a fraction of what they actually needed. That night, after I drove home to my apartment with my unshared news still burning inside me, I sat down with my laptop and my banking information, and I made a decision that I told myself was about love, but was probably more about proving something I could never quite name. I called my lawyer the next morning, a woman named Patricia, who'd helped me incorporate my business, and I asked her if it was possible to purchase someone's mortgage debt privately, to restructure their payments without them knowing the source. It took 6 weeks to arrange, cost me $340,000 of my own money I'd been saving for company expansion, for hiring more engineers, for scaling up production. But I did it anyway because they were drowning, and I had a life raft even if they couldn't see it. I told my parents the bank had made an error in their favor, that somehow their mortgage payments had been recalculated and reduced to almost nothing, and my father actually took credit for it. Told everyone at his restaurant that the bank had finally recognized his years of loyalty and good payment history. Never mind that he'd been 3 months behind before I intervened. My mother called it a miracle, Marcus called it lucky, and I sat in my office the day after they found out, staring at my company bank account that was now significantly lighter, feeling something complicated that mixed hurt with relief and resentment with love. Meanwhile, medtech innovations kept growing because good work has momentum that doesn't stop just because your heart is breaking. We got FDA approval for our second patent, expanded operations to 3 states, hired 12 more employees, moved into a bigger facility with actual lab space and manufacturing capabilities. I bought a condo downtown that same year, a beautiful 2-bedroom place with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, paid $680,000 in cash. But I never told my family I owned it, just let them assume I was renting, because it was easier than explaining where the money came from and watching them try to reconcile their image of me as a failure with the reality of my success. I told myself I was protecting them from feeling bad about all the years they'd dismissed me, that I was being generous by letting them save face, but the truth I couldn't quite admit was simpler and more painful. I was protecting myself from their judgment, from the inevitable questions about why I hadn't helped them sooner if I had money, from the possibility that even knowing the truth wouldn't change how they saw me. 2 years before that hospital hallway where everything would finally shatter, I sat in my parents' living room watching Marcus announce his engagement to Brittany Coleman, a corporate lawyer he'd met at some networking event. And the way my father's face lit up in that moment was something I'd spent my entire life hoping to see directed at me even once. He stood up immediately, pulled Marcus into a hug, then raised his glass of wine and said, "Finally, a daughter I can be proud of." And I know he meant it as a compliment to Brittany, as a way of welcoming her to the family. But the words landed in my chest like shrapnel because I was sitting right there, his actual daughter, and the implication was so clear it might as well have been written in skywriting. I forced my face into a smile, the kind I'd perfected over years of practice, and I toasted along with everyone else while something inside me quietly bled out. The next few weeks were consumed with wedding planning, or more specifically, engagement party planning, because my mother had decided that Marcus and Brittany deserved a celebration befitting their status, which apparently meant a budget of $30,000 for a single evening at the yacht club. I watched my parents stress over the cost at Sunday dinner, saw my mother's hands shake slightly as she tallied up the deposits for catering and flowers and the band, and Marcus offered to contribute $5,000 with this magnanimous expression that made my father clasp his shoulder and say, "You're a good son, the best son." I went home that night and wrote a check for $20,000, put it in an envelope with a card that said, "Congratulations from a family friend," and mailed it anonymously because I knew if they discovered it came from me, they'd either refuse it or worse, they'd accept it with that particular brand of confused disappointment they reserved for anything I did that didn't fit their narrative of who I was supposed to be. The engagement party itself was exactly the kind of event my family loved, full of people who worked in finance and law, people who could talk about mergers and acquisitions and billable hours, people who understood the kind of success my family valued. I brought Michael, a fellow engineer I'd been seeing casually for a few months, and within 5 minutes of arriving, my father had cornered him with, "So, what do you do?" And when Michael said he was a biomedical engineer working on prosthetic limb technology, my father actually said, "So you're both unemployed?" Like it was a joke, except his eyes weren't joking at all. Brittany found me later in the evening, genuinely kind in a way that made me understand what Marcus saw in her, and she asked about my work with real interest, wanted to know about the devices I was developing and the hospitals I was working with, and I was just starting to explain when my father appeared beside us and interrupted with, "Don't encourage her, Brittany. Sarah plays with medical gadgets. Marcus does real business." What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 2 weeks earlier, I'd gotten final FDA approval for my cardiac monitoring device, that contracts were being signed with hospital networks across 6 states, that my equipment would soon be saving lives in over 200 facilities, but I just smiled and excused myself to the bathroom, where I locked the door and stared at my reflection and wondered why I kept showing up to these events, kept subjecting myself to this particular brand of casual cruelty. On my way back from the bathroom, I passed the study where the door was partially open, and I heard my father's voice saying, "At least we only have to support her a few more years," and Marcus responding, "She's 26, Dad. When is she going to grow up?" And I stood there in the hallway in my cocktail dress that cost $800, wearing earrings that cost more than their monthly grocery bill, CEO of a company that would generate 8.2 million in revenue that year, and I realized they genuinely believed I was a failure, that this wasn't just dismissiveness or favoritism, but actual sincere conviction that I was somehow dependent on them, somehow unable to function as an adult. I left the party an hour later, told Michael I had a headache which wasn't entirely a lie, and he asked if I was okay in that careful way people do when they can see you're not okay, but aren't sure if they're allowed to push. And I lied and said yes because the truth was too complicated and too humiliating to explain. The truth being that my own family had so thoroughly dismissed my existence that they'd constructed an entire alternate reality where I was struggling and dependent, rather than successful and independent. And somewhere along the way, I'd become complicit in that reality by never correcting it, by letting them believe whatever they wanted to believe, because at least their disappointment in failure was something I understood, whereas I had no idea how they'd react to actual success. My 27th birthday fell on a Tuesday that year, and when my mother called to invite me to dinner, I felt that familiar flutter of hope I could never quite extinguish, the childish expectation that maybe this time would be different, maybe this year they'd remember it was supposed to be about me. I arrived at my parents' house at 6:30 exactly, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, something cheerful and bright that I thought might signal celebration, and the moment I walked through the door, I saw the cake on the dining room table with "Congratulations, Marcus" written across it in blue frosting, and I understood with perfect clarity what kind of evening this was going to be. My mother looked up from arranging plates and said, "Oh, Sarah, you're here. We're just celebrating Marcus's promotion to vice president. Isn't that wonderful? We can do something for your birthday another time." And I stood there in the doorway, holding my wine and my hope, while both turned sour in my hands. I stayed 20 minutes, just long enough to not make a scene, long enough to hug Marcus and say congratulations with a smile that hurt my face. And then I made an excuse about an early meeting and left while they were still toasting his success. And not a single person called that evening to apologize or acknowledge what had happened. Not even a text message saying happy birthday. 3 months later, I decided to host Thanksgiving at my condo, partly because I thought a change of venue might shift the family dynamic, and partly because I wanted them to see that I had built something beautiful, that I was capable and successful even if they couldn't recognize it. So I spent 2 days cooking and preparing my modern two-bedroom space with its floor-to-ceiling windows and view of downtown. When my family arrived, my father walked through the door, looked around at my carefully decorated home with its hardwood floors and contemporary furniture and original art on the walls, and his first words were, "Must be nice to waste money on fancy rentals." And I felt something deflate inside me. But I pushed forward and said, "I own it, Dad," hoping that would mean something, hoping that would register as achievement. His response was immediate and cutting, delivered with that particular tone of dismissive cruelty he'd perfected over decades. "With what money? Did some man buy it for you?" And Marcus laughed and added, "Probably student loans she'll never pay back." And neither of them knew that I'd paid $680,000 in cash for this place, that I'd earned every cent of it myself, that my company was growing faster than I could have imagined. I said nothing, just smiled, and led them to the dining room where I'd set the table with china I'd inherited from my grandmother. And the entire meal was consumed with conversation about Marcus's latest deals, his investment strategies, his upcoming wedding to Brittany, his achievements and accolades and prospects, while I sat at the head of my own table in my own home, feeling like a guest who'd accidentally wandered into someone else's celebration. My father asked at one point, between bites of the turkey I'd spent 4 hours preparing, "Sarah, your mother says you're still at that startup. When are you getting a stable job?" And I tried to explain that the company was doing well, that we'd just expanded, but he cut me off with, "I'm talking about a real job, benefits, security, not playing around." And what he didn't know was that MedTech Innovations now employed 47 people, that our revenue had reached $8.2 million annually, that I'd been featured in a national magazine's 40 Under 40 Healthcare Innovators list just 2 months earlier. When they finally left that evening, my father paused at the door and said, "Next time, let's meet somewhere we don't have to burden you." As if I hadn't invited them, as if I hadn't opened my home and my heart one more time hoping for something I was never going to receive. And I cleaned up alone in the kitchen afterward, washing dishes and putting away leftovers, while the city lights sparkled outside my windows, and I made a decision that I didn't fully articulate even to myself, but felt settle into my bones with quiet certainty. That was the last time I invited them to my home. Marcus's wedding took place 6 months before that hospital hallway confrontation, and it was exactly the kind of event my family had always dreamed of. 250 guests at the prestigious Meadowbrook Country Club, with its manicured golf course and crystal chandeliers and waitstaff in white gloves. The kind of celebration that announced to the world that the Chen family had arrived at some indefinable destination of success and respectability. I'd been asked to be a bridesmaid, which surprised me, until Brittany pulled me aside during the rehearsal dinner and said she'd insisted on it over my mother's suggestion that perhaps I'd prefer to just be a guest. And I felt grateful for her kindness, even as I recognized the implicit statement that my own family hadn't thought I belonged in the wedding party. My father's speech during the reception was everything I'd known it would be: 10 minutes of effusive praise about Marcus, about how proud he was of his son, about how Marcus was everything a father could want in a child, about the legacy of the Chen name being carried forward through his achievements, and now through his marriage to this remarkable woman. And not once in those 10 minutes did he mention that he had another child. Not once did his eyes even drift in my direction, where I stood at the edge of the bridal party table, trying to keep my face neutral while something inside me withered. What my father didn't know was that I'd contributed $10,000 to the wedding fund months earlier, another anonymous check with another fabricated story about a family friend who wanted to remain unnamed, because my parents had been stressed about covering their portion of the expenses, and I couldn't stand to watch them struggle, even if they'd never know I was the one who'd helped. During the gift opening, which happened before the reception in some kind of pre-celebration tradition I didn't understand, Marcus presented my parents with matching Rolex watches that he'd bought with his last bonus, And my father actually cried, held the watch box in his shaking hands, and said, "This is what success looks like. This is what makes a parent proud." And I stood there in my bridesmaid dress that cost $400 and pinched my thigh hard enough to leave a bruise so I wouldn't cry myself. I excused myself to the bathroom halfway through dinner, locked myself in a stall at the far end of the ladies' lounge, and let myself fall apart for exactly 5 minutes before wiping my eyes and fixing my makeup and walking back out into that celebration of everything I would never be in my family's eyes. Brittany found me at the sink, must have seen something in my face because she said, "Are you okay? I noticed your father," and trailed off, like she wasn't sure how to finish that sentence without being disrespectful, and I just said, "It's always been this way." And she looked at me with something that might have been pity or might have been understanding and asked, "What do you do exactly?" Marcus never really explains. And I gave her some vague answer about medical device development because I was afraid to say too much. Afraid that if I told her the truth, she'd think I was bragging or lying or trying to compete with my brother. She said something then that I held on to for months afterward. Said, "Whatever it is, you seem like you're doing well, I can tell." And it was such a small thing, but it meant everything because someone had finally looked at me and seen something beyond the family narrative of Sarah, the disappointing daughter. Later during the reception, my drunk Uncle Way found me at the bar and asked what I was doing for work these days, and before I could answer, Marcus appeared beside me and said, "Sarah's still figuring things out," speaking over me like I was a child. Even though he was 32 and I was 27, even though I was running a company while he was executing other people's investment strategies. When my father danced with Brittany, he made a toast to his daughter with such warmth and pride, and it took me a moment to realize he meant Brittany, that he was welcoming her to the family with more enthusiasm than he'd ever shown toward me in my entire life, and something inside me made a decision right then that I didn't fully acknowledge until much later. I left the wedding 2 hours before it ended, slipped out during the dancing when everyone was distracted, and no one noticed I was gone for another 2 hours. Not until my mother texted me at 11:30 asking, "Where did you go? You embarrassed us." As if my absence was somehow more noticeable than my presence had ever been. As if I'd committed some unforgivable breach of etiquette by leaving a celebration where I'd never really been welcome in the first place. I didn't respond to that text, just sat in my car in my empty condo parking garage, still wearing my bridesmaid dress, and I realized with perfect clarity that I was tired of being invisible unless I was doing something wrong, tired of existing in this liminal space where I was simultaneously ignored and blamed, simultaneously dismissed and expected to simply accept that dismissal with grace and gratitude. 3 months before that hospital hallway confrontation that would change everything, MedTech Innovations acquired a smaller competitor in Boston for $3.7 million, a strategic move that brought our total company valuation to $12 million and positioned us as a major player in the cardiac monitoring device market. And I sat in the conference room after signing the final papers, feeling pride and terror in equal measure because I knew this meant I could no longer hide what I'd built, that eventually the truth would emerge whether I wanted it to or not. I was the CEO and majority shareholder of a company worth $12 million, which meant my personal net worth had reached $9.4 million, a number so absurd and so removed from my family's perception of me that I sometimes wondered if I was living in two completely separate realities. One where I was Dr. Sarah Chen, successful entrepreneur and innovator, and another where I was just Sarah, the disappointing daughter who couldn't get her life together. A major healthcare innovation magazine had contacted me about an interview and profile piece for their annual 40 Under 40 issue. And my marketing director was thrilled, said it would be incredible publicity for the company. But all I could think about was whether my family would see it, whether this would be how they finally learned the truth. And I spent 3 sleepless nights considering whether I should tell them first, whether I should sit them down and explain everything before they read about it in a magazine. That Sunday, I went to my parents' house for our monthly dinner, the ritual I still maintain despite every instinct telling me to stop subjecting myself to these gatherings. And within 10 minutes of arriving, my father was complaining about money, about how expensive everything had become, about how they were barely getting by. And then he said, "Good thing Marcus helps us out, or I don't know what we'd do." And I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood because I was the one paying their $2,400 monthly mortgage. I had been paying it for 3 years, and he was crediting my brother for occasional checks that amounted to maybe $5,000 annually. Marcus arrived late, apologetic and beaming, and before he even sat down, he announced that Brittany was pregnant, that they were having a baby, and the explosion of joy that followed was genuine and beautiful and completely devastating to witness because I was happy for them, truly happy that they were starting this family. But the way my parents reacted made something ache in my chest that I didn't have words for. My father actually cried, stood up and hugged Marcus and said, "Finally, a grandchild. Finally, you've made us so happy." And my mother was sobbing with joy and already planning nursery colors and talking about how she'd babysit whenever they needed. And I sat there feeling invisible again, feeling like I was watching this celebration from behind glass, separated from the warmth of my family's love by some barrier I'd never been able to cross. We sat down to dinner, and my father looked at me across the table with that particular expression I'd learned to dread, that mix of disappointment and forced concern, and said, "Sarah, you should find someone. You should settle down. Your eggs are getting old." And before I could respond, Marcus laughed and said, "She needs a real career first. What man wants to support a grown woman?" And something hot and sharp rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down and said as calmly as I could manage, "I have a career." My father's response was immediate and dismissive, delivered while cutting his chicken like he was commenting on the weather. "Playing with test tubes isn't a career, Sarah. It's a hobby, and it's time you accepted that and found something stable." I almost told them everything right then, almost pulled out my phone and showed them the acquisition papers I'd signed 3 days earlier, almost explained that I employed 47 people and held 3 patents and had devices saving lives in 200 hospitals across the country. But something stopped me. Some instinct for self-preservation, or maybe just exhaustion. And I stayed silent while the conversation moved on to nursery furniture and baby names and Marcus's latest promotion. After dinner, my mother asked me to stay for a moment, said they needed to talk to me about something, and my father cleared his throat in that way he did when he was about to deliver what he considered wisdom. And he said, "Sarah, your mother and I have been talking, and we think you should move back home. It would help you save money instead of wasting it on rent every month, and you could help your mother around the house." Marcus nodded like this was the most reasonable suggestion in the world, and added, "It's actually a smart financial move, sis. Really it is." And I sat there looking at these 3 people who had no idea that I owned a $680,000 condo, that I had millions in the bank, that I was responsible for the roof over their heads, and I said quietly, "I'm fine where I am." My father's expression hardened, and he leaned forward and said, "Pride comes before a fall, Sarah, and you're going to learn that the hard way if you're not careful." And I gathered my things and left, drove home through streets that blurred because I was crying, and I sat in my car in my parking garage for 20 minutes before I could compose myself enough to go inside. I left that dinner knowing something would eventually break, that the gap between who I actually was and who they believed me to be had grown too wide to sustain, that eventually there would be a reckoning whether I wanted one or not. I just didn't know it would be me who broke. The morning of the hospital incident started like most Tuesday mornings in my corner office on the 32nd floor of the downtown financial district, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city that had become my home in ways my childhood house never was. And I was sitting in a conference room with 3 investors from a Silicon Valley venture capital firm discussing a $20 million expansion that would take medtech innovations into international markets and establish manufacturing facilities in 2 additional countries. My assistant Jennifer had knocked softly during a break in the meeting and said, "Dr. Chen, that magazine came out today. You're on page 34." And handed me the glossy healthcare innovation journal that I'd been both anticipating and dreading for 3 weeks. And there it was, a full spread with the headline, "The Woman Revolutionizing Cardiac Care, Dr. Sarah Chen's Medical Device Empire." Above a professional photograph of me in my lab coat, standing in front of the manufacturing floor, surrounded by the gleaming equipment that produced the devices currently saving lives in 200 hospitals across the country. The article detailed everything: my company's $12 million valuation, the 3 patents I held personally, the story of how I'd started in a shared laboratory space with 2 employees and a dream, my background in biomedical engineering, my PhD from MIT. And there was even a sidebar about my personal philosophy on healthcare innovation and making life-saving technology accessible. And I sat there holding this tangible proof of everything I'd accomplished, while my investors congratulated me on the publicity, and my marketing director beamed like a proud parent. I felt proud reading it, genuinely proud for maybe the first time in years. But underneath that pride was a gnawing anxiety about my family seeing it, about this being how they'd learn the truth instead of hearing it from me directly. And I'd already decided that morning that I would buy copies for each of them, that I would finally sit them down and explain everything, that maybe if they could see it in print from an objective third party, they would finally understand that I wasn't playing scientist or wasting my time with hobbies, but actually building something meaningful and substantial. The meeting wrapped up just after 1 p.m. with handshakes and promises to have contracts ready for review by end of week, and I was back at my desk responding to emails and planning how I would approach my family when my phone rang at 2:17 p.m. with my mother's number on the screen, and the sound that came through when I answered wasn't words, but a wail of pure panic that made my blood go cold before she managed to choke out, "Your father collapsed. Heart attack. They're taking him to Mercy General. Please come now, Sarah, please." I dropped everything, grabbed my keys and purse, told Jennifer to cancel my afternoon, and ran to the parking garage. And during the 45-minute drive to the hospital through traffic that felt deliberately obstructive, I found myself crying and praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in. Because despite everything my father had done and said, despite every dismissal and cruelty and moment of invisibility, he was still my father, and some part of me that I couldn't erase still loved him desperately and wanted his love in return. I arrived at Mercy General's ICU waiting room at 3:14 p.m. and found my mother collapsed in a plastic chair with mascara streaking her face, and Marcus standing near the window talking intensely on his phone with work. And I rushed to my mother and asked, "How is he? What did the doctor say? Is he going to be okay?" And she just grabbed my hands and sobbed while Marcus barely glanced up and said, "They're running tests. We don't know anything yet." My mother pulled back and said, "Oh, Sarah, what will we do? The medical bills, how will we ever pay for this?" And I said, "Don't worry about that now, Mom. Let's just focus on Dad being okay." And Marcus finally put his phone away and said, "Easy for you to say. Some of us will actually have to pay for this." And I bit back the response that I could pay for every cent of my father's care without making a dent in my accounts, that I'd probably end up doing exactly that whether they knew it or not. A doctor in blue scrubs came through the double doors 20 minutes later and told us that my father had suffered a mild heart attack, that his condition was stable, that they'd gotten to him quickly enough that the damage was minimal, that he would need monitoring and medication and lifestyle changes, but he was going to be fine. And the relief that washed over me was so intense, I had to sit down because my legs went weak, and my mother was crying again, but with joy this time. And Marcus was asking practical questions about recovery time and treatment plans like he was negotiating a business deal. The doctor said we could see him in 20 minutes once they had him settled in the ICU, and we sat in that waiting room in silence, my mother still crying softly, Marcus back on his phone, and me staring at the magazine still clutched in my purse, thinking about how I'd planned to share my success over dinner. And instead, I was here in this hospital waiting room, hoping my father would live long enough for me to finally tell him the truth. And I should have left then. Should have seen him just long enough to confirm he was alive and then walked away. But I stayed because some pathetic part of me still hoped that a near-death experience might change something, might finally make him see me as I actually was, instead of who he'd decided I must be. The nurse told us we could go in now, that my father was awake and stable, and my mother practically ran through the ICU doors, while Marcus and I followed more slowly, and when we entered the room, I saw my father propped up in the hospital bed surrounded by monitors and IV lines, his face pale, but his expression already irritated in that way that meant he was feeling well enough to be angry about his circumstances, and he was complaining to another nurse about the hospital food before we'd even reached his bedside, saying something about how they expected him to recover on this garbage, and I felt a strange mixture of relief that he was coherent enough to complain and dread about what was coming next, because I knew my father well enough to know that vulnerability made him cruel. He looked up as we came in and said, "About time. I've been lying here for hours wondering if anyone cared whether I lived or died." And my mother rushed to his side immediately, grabbing his hand and saying, "Oh, honey, we came as fast as we could. We were so worried." And Marcus positioned himself at the foot of the bed in that authoritative stance he used in business meetings and said, "How are you feeling, Dad?" And I hung back near the door, unsure of my place in this family tableau, unsure if I should approach or stay invisible as usual. My father's eyes swept over all of us, and he said, "Where were you all when I needed you? I could have died." And Marcus said, "I was in a meeting, Dad. Came as soon as I could." And my father's expression softened immediately, and he said, "That's my boy. Work is important, I understand." And then those eyes landed on me and hardened, and he said, "What's your excuse, Sarah?" And I felt my stomach clench the way it always did when he looked at me like that, like I was already guilty of something I hadn't done yet. And I said, "I came from work too, Dad. I got here as fast as I could." And he scoffed, actually scoffed, and said, "What work, your little hobby?" And I tried to let it go, tried to remember he'd just had a heart attack, tried to be the bigger person, and I said, "I'm just glad you're okay, that's what matters." But before anyone could respond, a nurse came in to check his vitals, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and efficient movements, and she looked at the monitors and then looked at me, and her eyes widened and she said, "Dr. Chen? I thought that was you, but I wasn't sure. I didn't know this was your father." And everything in the room seemed to freeze, and my father said, "Dr. Chen? She's not a real doctor, she just works in a lab somewhere." And the nurse looked confused, glancing between us, and she said, "Sir, your daughter is the CEO of MedTech Innovations. Her cardiac monitoring devices are used in this hospital. We have them on 3 floors." And my heart stopped. This wasn't how I wanted them to know. Not like this. Not in a hospital room with my father barely recovered from a heart attack. And my father said, "What is she talking about?" And the nurse seemed to realize she'd walked into something complicated, something family-related and tense, and she quickly finished checking the monitors and said, "I'll let you all talk," and left the room. And Marcus turned to me and said, "What was that about?" And I said, "Nothing. We can talk about this later. This isn't the time." But my father was already getting agitated. I could see his face reddening, could hear the monitor starting to beep faster as his blood pressure rose. And he said, "Talk about what? What lies have you been telling people? What have you done now, Sarah?" And I said, "Dad, please calm down. This isn't the time. You need to rest." But he wasn't going to calm down. I could see it in his eyes, that same look he got whenever he felt undermined or disrespected. That same expression that had preceded every major blow-up of my childhood. And I realized with a sinking feeling that I was about to pay for the nurse's innocent recognition, about to pay for existing in a way that contradicted the story my father had built about who I was. My father decided suddenly that he needed to get out of that room, that he needed to stretch his legs, despite having just had a heart attack less than 3 hours earlier. And when the doctor came back in to check on him, he demanded to be allowed up. And the doctor hesitated, but finally agreed that he could walk the hallway for a few minutes as long as someone stayed with him and helped unhook the portable monitors. And I watched as the nurses carefully disconnected some of the equipment and helped him into a hospital robe and slippers. And we moved as a strange family procession out into the hallway just outside the ICU, that sterile corridor with its fluorescent lights and smell of disinfectant, and other families clustered in small, worried groups near other rooms. And I should have known something was coming, should have recognized the dangerous set of his shoulders and the way his jaw was clenched. But I was still hoping we could get through this without a scene, still hoping he would let it go until he was recovered. He turned to face me the moment we were in the hallway and said loudly, loud enough that heads turned from 3 different family clusters, "Explain what that nurse meant. Explain what you've been telling people." And I said, "Dad, you just had a heart attack. Can we please talk about this later when you're feeling better?" But he cut me off and said, "Don't tell me what to do. I'm still your father." And I could see Marcus shifting uncomfortably, and my mother wringing her hands, and several nurses at the station looking over with concern, and Marcus said, "Just tell him, Sarah, just explain it." And I took a breath and said, "I started a company 6 years ago, medical devices, it's doing well, that's what the nurse was talking about." And my father's face was already getting red again, and he said, "Doing well? You told me you worked at some lab, you said you were just an employee." And I said, "I do work at a lab. Dad, my lab, my company, I own it." And his face was getting redder, and I could see the vein in his temple that always appeared. When he was really angry and he said, "And how exactly do you afford that? What man is funding you? Who are you sleeping with to get this money?" And the words hit me like a physical blow, and I heard someone nearby gasp, and I said, "No one is funding me, I built it myself, with my own work and my own skills." And he said, "Liar, you can't even pay rent. Your mother told me you've been struggling to make ends meet." And I was genuinely confused now and said, "What? Dad, I don't pay rent. I haven't lived at home in 6 years." And something in him snapped completely, and he was yelling now, really yelling, and he said, "Don't give me that. You've been living off us for years, bleeding us dry." And Marcus said, "Dad, she does have her own place, I've been there." But my father turned on him and screamed, "Shut up, Marcus! Shut up! This girl has been taking advantage of us and lying about it." And I said, "Dad, I don't understand what you're talking about. I moved out 6 years ago." And he was screaming now, his voice echoing down the corridor, "Pay rent or get out of my house." And I said desperately, "I don't live in your house." And he screamed, "You ungrateful parasite." And I reached out trying to calm him, trying to touch his arm, saying, "Please, you're going to hurt yourself, your heart." And that's when his hand came up fast and connected with my face with a crack that echoed down the entire hallway. The sound of his palm hitting my cheek so loud that it seemed to freeze everything, and the pain was sharp and immediate, and tears sprang to my eyes. Not from the physical hurt, but from the shock of it, from the public humiliation of it, and I heard my mother gasp and say, "Oh my God." But she didn't move toward me, didn't come to my defense, and Marcus just stood there frozen with his mouth open. And nurses were already running toward us, and I could see a security guard starting to move from the end of the hall. And my father was still yelling, his face purple now, screaming, get out, you're no daughter of mine." And I stood there with my hand on my burning cheek, feeling the eyes of every person in that hallway on me, nurses and doctors and other patients' families, all of them witnessing this moment of my ultimate humiliation, and the hallway went completely silent except for the sound of my father's heavy breathing and my mother's quiet crying, and something inside me that had been bending and bending for 28 years. Something that had absorbed every dismissal and every cruel word and every moment of invisibility, that thing finally snapped clean through. I stood there perfectly still with my hand pressed against my burning cheek, and I could feel every eye in that hallway on me, nurses and doctors and patients' families all frozen in shock at what they'd just witnessed, and a nurse rushed forward saying, "Sir, you cannot assault people in this hospital. I'm calling security." And I heard the security guard's radio crackling as he moved closer, and my mother grabbed my father's arm and said in that familiar, pleading voice, "Sarah, Just apologize. You know how he gets. Just say you're sorry. And I turned to look at her, really look at her, this woman who had spent my entire life asking me to make myself smaller so my father could feel bigger. And I said, apologize for what? And she said, don't make this worse. Think of his heart. He just had a heart attack, Sarah. And something clicked in my mind in that moment. A sudden terrible clarity that this pattern would never end, that I could spend the rest of my life apologizing for existing, and it would never be enough. And I said quietly but firmly, no. And my father's eyes widened and he said, what did you say to me? And I said louder, my voice steady now. I said no, no more. And Marcus stepped forward saying, Sarah, come on, don't do this here. Let's just go somewhere and calm down. And I looked at him and said, do what, Marcus? Tell the truth? I think it's time for the truth. And my father was still breathing hard, his face red, and he said, the truth is, you're a burden and a disappointment, and you always have been. And I reached into my purse and pulled out the folded magazine, the one my assistant had given me that morning that felt like a lifetime ago now, and I said, is that what you think? And I unfolded it and handed it to Marcus, and he took it with a confused expression and started reading, and his eyes got wider and wider, and he said, Sarah, is this real? Is this actually real? And my father said, what is it? What is she showing you? And Marcus started reading aloud, his voice shaking slightly. Dr. Sarah Chen, 28, CEO of MedTech Innovations, has built a $12 million medical device empire that is revolutionizing cardiac care across the country. And my father said, that's impossible, she's lying, this is fake. And I pulled out my phone with hands that were steadier than I expected and opened my company website and turned it so they could all see. The photo of me in my lab coat surrounded by my team, the pictures of my office and our facility and the devices we manufacture. And my mother said, I don't understand, Sarah, what is this? And I said, I have 47 employees, 3 patents, my devices are in 200 hospitals across the country. And my father said, you're lying, this is all fake, you made this up somehow. And the nurse who had recognized me earlier, who had started this whole thing, stepped forward and said, it's not fake, sir. We use her equipment on 3 floors of this hospital. Her cardiac monitoring system has saved countless lives. And I looked at my father and said, my voice shaking now but strong, and for the last 3 years, I've been paying your mortgage. And the silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead and someone's monitor beeping 3 rooms away. And my father's face went completely white, and my mother grabbed the wall for support, and Marcus just stared at me like he'd never seen me before in his entire life. My father stared at me with his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't form words. And finally he said, what are you talking about? And I took a breath that felt like it went all the way down to my feet and said, 3 years ago, when your restaurant was failing and you were losing $80,000 and facing bankruptcy, I bought your mortgage debt for $340,000 and restructured your payments. The bank error that reduced what you owed every month, that wasn't an error, that was me. And my mother's hand went to her mouth and she said, Sarah, why didn't you tell us? And I felt something bitter rise in my throat and said, because every time I tried to share anything with you, anything about my work or my life or my success, I was shut down. I was told I was playing around. I was told to get a real job. And Marcus said slowly, the engagement party money, that anonymous gift. And I looked at him and said, me, the $20,000 that came from a supposed family friend, that was me. And my father was sputtering now, his face going from white to red and back again, and he said, this is ridiculous. You expect me to believe that you have that kind of money? And I pulled out my phone again, with hands that weren't shaking anymore, and opened my banking app and turned the screen toward them. And I watched their faces as they saw the transaction history, the monthly $2,400 transfers to the mortgage company going back 3 years. The $20,000 transfer marked Marcus' engagement. The $10,000 transfer marked Marcus' wedding, all of it right there in black and white. And Marcus said, "You paid for our wedding. You paid for part of our wedding." And I said, "Part of it? Yes. I wanted you to be happy. I wanted your day to be perfect." And my father said, "Why would you do this? Why would you hide it?" And something in his voice almost sounded hurt, almost sounded genuine. And I said, "Because the one time I tried to tell you about my success, the one time I tried to share that my company had landed a major contract, you laughed in my face. You called it playing scientist. You told me to get a real job and stop wasting everyone's time." And my mother was crying now, really crying. And she said, "We didn't know, Sarah. We didn't know any of this." And I looked at her and said, "You didn't want to know, Mom. It was easier to believe I was failing, easier to believe I was the disappointment, because that's the role you gave me, and I played it for 28 years." And a doctor was approaching now saying, "I need everyone to calm down. Mr. Chen needs rest. His heart rate is elevated." And my father said, "I don't need rest. I need answers. I need to understand what's happening." And I said quietly, "You don't need answers, Dad. You need someone to be disappointed in, someone to feel superior to, and I'm done being that person." And I turned to walk away, and my father said loudly, "If you walk away now, you're not my daughter." And I stopped and turned back and looked at him lying there in his hospital gown, with all his monitors beeping, and said, "I haven't been your daughter for a long time, you made sure of that." I looked at my father and considered it, really considered pressing charges against this man who had just struck me in a public hospital hallway, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Actual fear. Fear that there might finally be consequences for his actions, and my mother grabbed my arm and said, "Please, Sarah, he's sick. He didn't mean it. You know he has a temper, but he loves you." And I pulled my arm away gently and said, "He meant every word, Mom. He always has." And there was this long pause where everyone in that hallway seemed to be holding their breath, the security guard with his hand near his radio, the nurses watching carefully, my father looking smaller somehow in his hospital gown. And I turned to the security guard and said, "No, no charges, but I want him to know something." And I looked at my father directly and said, "I don't need your approval anymore. I don't need you to be proud of me. I don't need anything from you." And my father opened his mouth and said, "Sarah." But I kept talking, the words coming now like they'd been building for 28 years. And I said, "I'm successful, I'm accomplished. I've saved lives with the work I do, and I did it all while you told me I was worthless, while you called my work playing around, while you made me feel like I was nothing." And I reached into my purse and pulled out my checkbook, the leather one with my company name embossed on it, and I wrote a check right there in the hallway, with everyone watching, my hand steady, and I handed it to my mother and said, $50,000 for his medical bills, for whatever care he needs. After that, I'm done." And my mother took the check with shaking hands and said, "Done with what? What do you mean, done?" And I said, "Done carrying this family, done being invisible, done hoping you'll finally see me." And Marcus stepped forward and said, "Sarah, please, can we talk about this? Really talk?" And I looked at him and said, "We've had 28 years to talk about this, Marcus. You were never interested before." And my father said weakly, from where he stood supported by the wall, "I'm your father, you owe me respect." And something in the way he said it, still making demands, still expecting deference even now, made everything crystal clear. And I said, "I owed you nothing. You're my father by biology, but not by behavior. But I still paid your mortgage for 3 years. I still came when you were sick. I still loved you despite everything you did." And I paused and felt tears on my face. But my voice stayed strong, and I said, "But love isn't enough anymore." And my mother said, "What are you saying, Sarah? What are you saying?" And I said, "I'm saying goodbye. You can have the house, it's paid off. You can have the money for medical bills, but you can't have me anymore." And my father said, "You don't mean that, you're upset, you'll calm down." And I said, "I've never meant anything more in my entire life." And that's when I saw Brittany appear from the waiting room, and she must have heard everything because her face was pale, and she looked at Marcus and said, "Marcus, we need to talk right now." And Marcus looked torn, actually torn for the first time, looking between his father and his wife. And he chose his wife and walked away with her. And I felt something like pride for him in that moment. And I looked at my parents one more time and said, "Goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, Dad." And my mother said, "How long? How long are you going to do this?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "How long are you going to punish us?" And I said, "I don't know. Maybe forever. Maybe until you understand what you did to me all these years." And my mother was crying now, really crying. And she said, "We're your family, Sarah. We're your family." And I looked at her and felt something break and reform inside me, and I said, "No, family doesn't treat each other like this. You're just people I'm related to." And I turned and walked down that hospital hallway with my head up for the first time in years. And behind me I heard my mother sobbing and my father saying something I couldn't make out. And I didn't turn around. I just kept walking toward the elevator, past all those watching eyes, past the nurses and the security guard and the other families who had witnessed everything. And I pushed the button and waited, and the doors opened, and I stepped inside. And only when those doors closed, and I was alone, did I let myself really feel it. The weight lifting off my shoulders, the freedom of finally choosing myself. 3 days after I walked out of that hospital, I sat in my office on the 23rd floor overlooking the city and stared at my phone, which showed 47 missed calls from my mother. And I didn't listen to a single voicemail, just let them pile up like evidence of everything I'd finally escaped. And there was one text from Marcus that said, "We need to talk, please." And I didn't respond to that either. And instead, I focused on work, on the quarterly reports and the investor meetings, and the new prototype my team was developing. And I found something like peace in the routine of it, in the predictability of problems that could actually be solved with effort and intelligence, instead of the impossible task of making my parents see me. And my assistant Jennifer noticed something different about me on the fourth day when I came in early and stayed late working on patent applications, and she said, "Whatever happened this weekend, you seem different, lighter somehow." And I looked up from my desk and said, "I think I am." And I meant it because there was this space inside me that had always been filled with hoping and wanting and needing their approval. And now that space was just empty. Not in a bad way, but in a way that felt like possibility. Like I could fill it with something better than their conditional love. And the week passed with me ignoring calls and deleting voicemails without listening and throwing myself into the work that had always been the one thing that made sense to me. And then on Sunday afternoon, when I was home in my condo, reading through research papers, there was a knock at my door. And when I opened it, Brittany stood there alone without Marcus. And I felt my guard go up immediately, but she said, "I'm not here for them. I'm here for me. I need to know what I'm married into." And something about the way she said it, the genuine concern in her eyes, made me step aside and let her in. And we sat in my living room with tea between us, and I told her everything, not just what happened at the hospital, but years of it, the pattern of dismissal and cruelty, masked as concern, and the way I'd been invisible unless I was doing something wrong. And Brittany had tears in her eyes by the time I finished, and she said, "I had no idea, Sarah. Marcus never told me any of this." And I said, "He didn't see it. He was the golden child, the favorite. He never had to notice what was happening to me." And Brittany said, "I made him read that article about you, really read it, and he cried." And I felt surprise move through me and said, "Marcus cried?" And she nodded and said, "He said he doesn't remember it being this bad, but I told him that's exactly the problem. He never noticed because it wasn't happening to him." And we sat in silence for a moment before she said, "Your father wants to apologize." And I laughed, actually laughed, and said, "I'm sure he does now that he knows I have money." And Brittany started to say, "It's not about the money." But I interrupted and said, "Isn't it though? He hit me when he thought I was worthless." Now he wants to apologize because I'm successful, because I'm not the failure he believed I was. And Brittany didn't have an answer for that, and I watched her process it, and finally she said, Marcus wants to see you, to really talk. And I said, I don't know if I'm ready for that. And she said, I understand, but I want you to know I'm on your side, and your niece or nephew deserves to know their amazing aunt. And something in my chest cracked open at that, the first real crack in the armor I'd built in that hospital hallway. And I said, You think I'm amazing? And Brittany reached across and took my hand and said, Sarah, you're extraordinary. And I'm sorry no one in that family told you sooner. And we hugged and both cried. And when she left with a promise to stay in touch, regardless of what happened with Marcus and my parents, I sat alone in my condo that night, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, something unfamiliar. That took me a while to recognize, and when I finally named it, I realized it was possibility. Not happiness exactly, but the sense that maybe, just maybe, something different could grow from the wreckage of what I'd left behind. 2 months after I walked out of that hospital, I still hadn't spoken to my parents, and my contact with Marcus had been limited to a handful of careful text messages where he asked how I was and I gave brief, polite responses. And I'd settled into something that felt like peace, or at least the beginning of it, spending my days at the office where my team was working on a new prototype that could detect arterial blockages earlier than anything currently on the market, and my evenings in my condo where I'd started actually decorating instead of just existing in the space. And on a Sunday afternoon in late autumn when the light was golden through my windows, there was a knock at my door, and when I opened it, Marcus stood there alone, holding a manila envelope and looking uncertain in a way I'd never seen him look before. And I said, What are you doing here? And he said, I've been trying to reach you for weeks, please. Just give me 5 minutes. And something in his face, the genuine humility there, made me step aside and let him in. And we sat in my living room with the afternoon light between us. And he said, I read everything about your company. I called people you work with. I looked up your patents and your FDA approvals, Sarah. You're incredible. You're actually incredible. And I felt tears prick my eyes, but I kept my voice steady and said, I've always been incredible, Marcus. You just never looked. And he nodded and said, I know, and I'm sorry, really truly sorry. And he handed me the envelope, and when I opened it, there was a check for $50,000, and I said, What is this? And he said, All the money you spent on my wedding and engagement and everything else I can calculate with interest. And I said, I don't want your money, Marcus. And he said, I know you don't need it, but I need to give it. I need to try to make this right. And we sat in silence for a long moment before he said, Dad's been different since the hospital. The heart attack scared him, but realizing what you've done, what you've been doing all these years, it broke something in him. And I said, Good, and meant it. And Marcus said, He wants to see you, so does Mom. And I said, I'm not ready. And he said, I know. I told them you might never be ready and that they'd have to accept that. And I said, What did Dad say to that? And Marcus said, He cried, first time I've ever seen him cry. And I felt something move in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe recognition that change might actually be possible. And I said, Did he cry because he hit me or because he found out I'm successful? And Marcus thought carefully before answering, Honestly, probably both. But he's in therapy now, Mom too. And I said, Therapy? Unable to hide my surprise. And Marcus said, I told them it was the only way I'd let them see their grandchild. Brittany backed me up. And I said, You're having a baby. And he smiled for the first time since arriving and said, A girl. We're naming her Grace. And then after a pause he said, And we want you to be her godmother. And I started crying then, really crying. And Marcus said, I don't expect you to forgive us, any of us, but I'm asking you not to give up on the possibility. And I said through tears, I need time. And he said, Take all the time you need, years if that's what it takes. Just don't disappear completely. And he left the check on my coffee table and left. And that evening, I stood at my window looking out at the city lights and thinking about family and forgiveness and worth. And my phone buzzed with an email from my mother with the subject line, "I'm sorry." And I stared at it for a long time before deciding not to open it yet, but also not to delete it. And I thought about how I didn't know if I'd ever have the family I wanted, the family I'd spent 28 years hoping for, but I finally had something better. I had myself, I had my work, I had the knowledge of my own worth independent of their recognition, and maybe someday that would be enough for them too. But even if it wasn't, it was enough for me. And I went to my home office and pulled up the designs for the new cardiac monitor and lost myself in the work that had always made sense to me, the work that saved lives, the work that proved I was exactly who I'd always known I was, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt something close to peace.